I knew Tobias. He might not have known me because I've come and gone from Galvin's charity orphanage so quickly. But in my short stay, Tobias had stood out amongst the others. He was no ordinary orphan. He'd been educated as a child and continued to read anything he could get his hands on. He was given special privileges at the orphanage because it was felt he was one of the few with any hopes of making a success of his life. Tobias glanced my way. You're bleeding. I brushed at my cheek mark on my neck. It's mostly stopped. That was as much concern as he wished to invest. Do I know you? I stayed here about 6 months ago. Yeah, I remember. Locked the headmaster out of the orphanage for an entire night, didn't you? The grin on my face became my confession. You have to admit, we ate well that night for once. It's not funny, Tobias scolded. Maybe we don't eat well most of the time, but it's because there's not a lot of food to go around. You gave out a week's worth of food that night. It was a very long, very hungry week after that. My grin faded. I hadn't known that. We rode for over an hour through a lonely plain covered in gorse and nettle. Tobias remarked that he found it beautiful in a desolate sort of way. I saw the desolation, but the beauty escaped me. Eventually, it became dark enough that Moat suggested we find a place to stop for the night. The closest town was still Gelvin's behind us, rather than anything yet ahead, so I didn't think it should matter too much where we camped. But Mott still took us away farther until the vegetation changed and he found a small clearing surrounded by tall willow trees and thick bushes. They're hiding us, I muttered to the other boys. Roden shook his head back at me and said, It's safer here than out in the open. They're protecting us. Ma jumped off the wagon and began shouting orders at each for us what to unload from the wagon and where to put it. Mostly blankets and, I hoped, food. I was assigned to remain in the wagon and hand things to the others on the ground. Afraid I'll run away? I asked. And trust you get here will have to be earned, Mont said. And I'd say you have a great deal more to earn than the others. He nodded at a sock near my foot. Hand me that. Although Connor was the master of our group, Mont was clearly the one keeping our show running. He was no ordinary useless vigil. At least I noticed that he didn't need to ask Connor permission for everything. And when Mott issued orders to Cregan, Cregan did as he was told. While we worked, Connor stationed himself on a fallen log to peruse a tattered leather-bound book. Every now and then he glanced up, studying each of us with more than a casual examination, then returned to his book. Cregan got a fire going, and afterwards Mott instructed us to gather around so that Connor could talk to us. Talk to us, I said. When do we eat? We eat after the talk, Connor said, closing his book and standing. Come, boys, sit. I jumped out of the wagon and squeezed onto the edge of a long rodent and Tobias had dragged near the fire. They weren't too pleased to have me there, but didn't complain either. Laramar squatted on the ground. I considered offering him my seat, since he was still coughing, but I guess he wouldn't take it anyways. Connor coughed too, although his was kind of meant to get our attention. The cough wasn't necessary. We were already watching him. I haven't said much as to why I've collected you boys, Connor began. I'm sure in your heads you've created all sorts of speculation, from the likely and plausible to the wild and impossible. What I have in mind is closer to the latter of those. Tobias sat up straighter. I already disliked him as much as Roden, even though there had been far more times for me to learn to dislike Roden. I cannot deny there's danger with my plan, Connor said. If we fail, there will be terrible consequences, but if we succeed, the rewards are beyond your imagination. I wasn't sure about that. I could imagine some fairly big rewards. In the end, only one can be chosen. I need the boy who proves himself to be the closest fit with my plan, and my plan is very demanding and very specific. Tobias raised his hand, a sign that he had been educated at the orphanage I came from. A person only raised a hand if he was about to hit someone with it. Sir, what is your plan? Excellent question, Tobias. But it's also a very secret plan. So, what I'd like to do first is offer any of you the chance to leave now. You may leave with no feelings of regret or cowardice. I've been very upfront about both the dangers and the rewards. If you don't feel that this is for you, then this is your opportunity to leave. Roden looked at me. I arched my eyebrows in response. He wanted me to leave, that was clear. And I would have stood right then, except for a nagging voice in my head that told me something was wrong. So I kept still. Latimer raised his hand, not because he'd been trained to, but because it had worked for Tobias. Sir, I think I'd like to leave. I'm not fit to compete with these other boys, and frankly, I'm not one to face danger, even for great rewards. Apparently, the nagging voice hadn't visited Latimer's head. Certainly, you may leave. Connor politely raised a hand toward the wagon. Why don't you get back in there, and I'll have Cregan drive you to the nearest town. Tonight? The rest of us have more to discuss tonight. So, yes, go right now. Latimer gave an apologetic smile to us and thanked Connor for understanding. I nodded a goodbye to him and wondered, like I'm sure Roden and Tobias did, if he'd be smart to make the same choice. Connor hadn't said what would happen to the boys he didn't pick for his plan, nor just how dangerous things might get. Then I realized what my instincts had been trying to tell me. Mont was ahead of us, motioning Latimer toward the wagon. Where was Cregan? I stood and yelled, Latimer, stop! My warning only gave Latimer time to turn from climbing into the wagon. His eyes widened as he saw what I had sensed. An arrow whooshed past me and pierced his chest. Latimer yelped like a wounded dog and fell backwards on the ground, dead. With a furious cry, I leapt toward Cregan, who was still partially hidden in the shadows behind us, and I tackled him to the ground. Cregan went for the knife at his waist, but one hand still held the bow he'd used to kill Latimer, so I got the knife first. With my body crisscrossed over Cregan's, I started to crawl off him. Vermont lunged at me from behind, and I collapsed face down into the dirt. Cregan took a deep breath, then sat up and easily wrestled the knife from my hand. That was probably a good thing. I don't know what I would have done if Mott hadn't stopped me. You killed him, I growled, getting a taste of dirt into my mouth. Connor knelt beside me and lowered himself so that I could see his face. His voice was eerily calm. Latimer was sick, Sage. He wasn't going to get better, and I think he proved a good lesson for the rest of you. Now you can get up and rejoin the other boys, or you can take a wagon ride with Latimer. It's your choice. I thrust my jaw forward and glared at Connor, then finally said, I suppose Latimer won't be much company now. I'll stay here. Excellent decision, Connor clapped a hand on the back, as if we were old friends. He nodded at Mott, who let me go, then added, I'm sure Latimer's death is a shock to you, but it was important for you three to understand the seriousness of what we are doing. When I sat up, Cregan's legs brushed roughly past me as he went to help lift Latimer's body into the wagon. Normally, I'd been kicked. Normally, I have kicked him in return, but the moment I was too stunned to think. Bury him deep, Connor said. Still on the log, Tobias was pale and perfectly still. Roden looked as if he was having trouble breathing. My wasn't working any better. It didn't help that Mott had rudely pressed his knee into my back for the last couple of minutes. Connor's smile was a thin on his face. Sage, I believe your question earlier was why we had the meeting before we ate. This is why. So we wouldn't waste our food. His eyes passed over to Roden and Tobias. How about it then? Does anybody else want to leave?